Hey everyone, and welcome to another video where today I'm going to be tier ranking every single fantasy book that I read this year. 2020 has definitely been the year where I've got back into reading fantasy. It was one of my favourite genres when I was a kid, but for some reason as I got older I just started prioritising other genres. But this year I have read over 25 fantasy books, which seems like a lot, and I wanted to do a video talking about all of the books or all of the fantasy books that I read this year, and I just thought that a tier rank would be a really fun way to do that. But I'm going to start just by quickly going through the ranking system that I've come up with, and this is all I think pretty self-explanatory, but at the top I've got new favourite, which means that I loved it. Then we have great, which means that I also loved it, but it wasn't quite a new favourite, followed by good, average, and did not like at the bottom. So I'm going to start by talking about the first fantasy book that I actually read this year, and I had forgot that I'd read this book until I started putting this list together, which probably tells you all you really need to know. But the book I'm talking about is Sauvage by Pullman. This is a prequel to the His Dark Materials trilogy, which was one of my favourite series when I was a kid. Sauvage is set, I think it's 12 years before the events that happen in the Northern Lights or the Golden Compass, and it follows a boy called Malcolm who has to protect Lyra, who is a baby in this book. That might sound really vague, but honestly I can't remember a lot of what happened in this book. The first 60% was very slow. It's very character driven, and I think that's the problem, is that I didn't feel any real warmth towards Malcolm. I didn't hate him, but he came across as quite bland to me, and so I spent a lot of the book feeling a little bit bored. And then towards the end things did start to pick up a lot, but this is a book that's I think over 600 pages, and for a book that size I didn't think that it was worth it. I didn't think that it added anything to the series as a whole. I'm going to stick this in the average tier. I didn't hate it, and I wouldn't want to put anyone off from reading it, but it wasn't my kind of thing. The next book I'm going to talk about is another prequel to a pretty popular series, and that is The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Suzanne, which is of course a prequel to The Hunger Games. The best way to describe this book is that it's a President Snow origin story. It's set during the 10th annual Hunger Games, and it follows a young President Snow before he was president as he mentors a tribute in these Hunger Games. There were certain parts of this book that I did like, but there were also certain parts of this book that felt a bit pointless, and so I did end up giving this 3 stars. I went into a lot more detail on this in my most disappointing books of the year video, but yeah, again, I don't think I hated this book. I think that it was very average, and so I think that's the tier that I'm going to go with. Maybe I'll change my mind later though. The next book on my list is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, and this is a really hard book to explain, but it basically follows 2 young magicians who have been trained since they were children, since they were very young, to compete in this magical competition, but they don't know who they're competing against. All they really know is that the setting for this competition is this night circus. I actually really liked this book. I especially liked the writing and how it was very beautiful and lyrical, and there was a lot of atmosphere throughout the book. I think if you like plot-driven books, then this would not be for you, but if you do like books that are very atmospherical, is that a word, or that are very character-driven, then I think I would recommend this book, because I did like it and I ended up giving it 4 stars. I think for that reason I'm going to stick it in the great category. It wasn't quite a new favourite, but I did really enjoy it. Next on my list is Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, and this is the first book in the Grishaverse series. I'm actually going to talk about all of these books together because I think that's going to be easiest, but the Shadow and Bone trilogy follows a girl called Alina who lives in this country called Ravka that is split in half by this shadow fold, and Alina learns that she has these magical powers that could finally destroy the shadow fold and help to unite her country. I think if you read a lot of fantasy, then it would be really easy to be critical of this book. However, I really liked it, and the first 2 books were easy 4 stars for me. The last book was a 3-star because I personally didn't love the ending. I think that it could have been done in a better way, but I think that they're solid. I know that they get a lot of hate in comparison to the Six of Crows duology, which I'm going to come on to next, but I'm going to stick these in the great category, or no, I'm going to stick Shadow and Bone and Siege and Storm in the great category, and then Ruin and Rising I think is going to be in good, because I did enjoy that book for the most part. I just would have preferred a different ending. Okay, so the next 2 books I'm going to talk about are also part of the Grishaverse, and they are Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. Both of these books were easily new favourites for me. I absolutely loved them. I loved the whole plot and how it was this heist theme. I've seen a few people say that this is like Ocean's 11 but set in a fantasy world, and I think that's a pretty accurate description. You follow this group of characters as they attempt to break into this fortress that supposedly can't be broken into, and I love the characters in this. I thought that they were really well developed. I love that the book is told from multiple perspectives, so you get to know them all individually. If you like fantasy books that have that found family aspect, then I definitely recommend this. Okay, so this next book I actually listened to as an audio book. I read the physical copy of this book years and years ago, but I had a free trial for Audible, and this was the book that I decided to go for, mainly because it's quite a long book. And for some reason in my brain, I just thought, if I'm going to use a free credit on a book, I want it to be one that's like 30 hours long. And it was 30 hours long. It took me, I think, about 6 weeks to listen to this book. And that was based on me listening to around half an hour to an hour every day. So Game of Thrones, for anyone who doesn't know, is an epic adult high fantasy series that's set in this world where you have all of these different families and there's lots of politics that are going on, lots of people that are fighting to own the throne. What I will say about this audiobook though is that the way that the narrator pronounces certain names is different to how they're pronounced in the TV show. And because I've seen the TV show, it did throw me a little bit at first, but obviously this is just a completely personal thing. I know that some people would not be bothered by that at all, but I did like this. I think I'm going to stick it in the good tier because it wasn't bad. It was definitely better than average, but it wasn't quite great or a new favourite. The next book on my list is Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, and this was easily one of my favourite fantasy books that I read this year. It's going straight to the top of the list. For anyone who doesn't know, this follows a librarian called Laszlo Strange, who is obsessed with learning about this lost city of Weep. He would absolutely love to have the opportunity to go to Weep and learn what happened there to cut it off from the rest of the world, and why can no one actually remember what this city is called. What I really loved about this book was the writing. I thought it was so beautiful and lyrical, and I love the way that Laini Taylor builds mystery into her books, because in the beginning I didn't really have a clue what was going on, but you have to kind of have faith that it's all going to be explained eventually, and there does get that moment where suddenly everything clicks and you think, okay, I get it. Muse of Nightmares, which is the second book in the duology, was also a new favourite. I really liked this. I think the pace was a little bit quicker than Strange the Dreamer. That was probably my only criticism with the first book, is that it was very, very slow and it was quite hard to get into, but I didn't get that with Muse of Nightmares, and I liked the way that it explored other characters and showed this different side to them. The only thing I will say is that this book is generally categorised as being a young adult book. I would disagree with that because it definitely has some more adult themes, and so just something to be aware of if you are thinking of reading this. Okay, so next on my list I have the Raven Cycle series by Maggie Stiefvater, and I don't know what I'm going to do about these books because I enjoyed this series the more that I read it. The first book I thought was good, and I was intrigued enough that when I finished it I did want to continue the series, but it wasn't a new favourite. This is a very slow and character-driven series, which I wasn't expecting going into it, but I also think that it's very similar to Laini Taylor's books in the sense that certain things from book one don't make a lot of sense until later books, and so you have to kind of stick with it and have hope that you will eventually get that light bulb moment where everything makes sense. I think I'm actually going to stick all of these in the good tier because The Raven King actually was almost a new favourite. I really, really liked that book right up until the last few chapters, which felt very rushed. It was a little disappointing because most of the series is building up and building up to this one moment, and it didn't really make a lot of sense. It wasn't very satisfying, and so that did end up bringing my rating down. I think that if I went back and read this series again, I would appreciate it a lot more now that I know the characters, but for now I think I am going to put all four of these in good, which I'm happy with that. Next on my list I have the A Court of Thorns and Roses series by Sarah J Maas, and for anyone who doesn't know, this is an adult fantasy romance series that follows a young woman called Feyre who is out hunting in the woods by her house when she kills this wolf that turns out to be a fairy, and as punishment she has to go across the wall and live in this fairy kingdom where this curse has affected the fae that she's living with, and she has to try and work out what's going on. I completely understand that this series is not for everyone, and I would always recommend this more to people that are looking for a romance book that's set within a fantasy world rather than a fantasy book that has romance elements, because the romance is a very strong theme throughout the book and it's a very central part of the plot. I think I'm actually going to stick the first book in this series in the good tier because I liked it and I thought that it was slightly above average, but I didn't feel like I was really invested in the story until maybe the last third, where the pace picked up and there was a lot more action. I do think that if you read the first book in this series and you do think that it's average, then please stick with it because the second book, Oh my goodness, it is so much better. A Court of Mist and Fury is one of my new favourite books. I absolutely loved this. I loved the whole way that the romance went. I'm not going to say any more because of spoilers, but that book made me cry. It made me laugh. I absolutely loved it, and I would quite happily reread the series over and over again just for that second book. A Court of Wings and Ruin, I think I'm going to stick in the great tier, because I also enjoyed it, but there were a few little niggly things that got to me that's really just a personal thing. And I also wasn't a huge fan of the ending. Obviously, no spoilers. I think that it could have been done in a better way. It was good, it was great, but not a new favourite. Next on my list is Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi, and I'm going to stick this in great. I really enjoyed this. For anyone who doesn't know, it's a West African inspired young adult fantasy that's set in this world where there used to be these clans that could control magic. However, magic disappeared overnight and no one really knows why, but the king actually executed all of the magi who could control this magic. And now we pick up many years later where this character called Zelly, who is descended from one of these magi, she has this opportunity to bring magic back to her people. As I think I said, I really enjoyed this book. I thought the world was really interesting and it was so fast paced. This is one of the fastest paced fantasy books that I've read. There was so much action, and even though it's quite a long book, I can remember that I read it quite quickly, and I do really want to read the sequel at some point. The next book on my list is Caraval by Stephanie Garber, and unfortunately I did not like this book. I think I gave it 2 stars in the end. It follows 2 sisters who have always dreamed of going to this Caraval, which is this magical game that takes place on this island across the world, and one year they get this opportunity to go, but one of the sisters goes missing and the other sister has to spend the rest of the game trying to find her. This book just really wasn't for me. I was expecting there to be more of a magical atmosphere, but it just felt a bit flat and the characters were kind of horrible. I really did not like any of the characters. I had this feeling throughout that I knew how it was going to end, and I was right and I hated it. There was also a romance in this book that I didn't feel was very well developed. It all felt a bit insta-love, and unfortunately I'm just not interested in reading the rest of the series. The next book on my list is another book that I did not like, and that was City of Bones by Cassandra Clare. This follows a girl called Clare who basically discovers the existence of shadow hunters who are demon hunters, and yeah, this book wasn't for me. I actually listened to the audiobook and I really enjoyed it. I thought that the narration was very enthusiastic, and if I hadn't been listening to the audiobook, if I'd been reading a physical copy of this book, I probably would have DNF'd it. In general, I just thought the plot was really predictable, and I hate books that are predictable, so yeah, didn't like it, would probably not read the rest of the series. The next few books on my list are The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. I wasn't sure whether to include these because these were rereads for me, but I am going to quickly rank them. So The Hobbit isn't so much a new favourite, more of an old favourite that I rediscovered. It was one of my favourite books as a kid, and I loved reading it as an adult just as much as I did back then. So far with The Lord of the Rings, I've only read The Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers. I'm currently reading The Return of the King, and I am enjoying it, or I'm enjoying it as much as I can be because I'm still only on the 2nd chapter, but I really love these books. I love the atmosphere and the characters. I do think that I feel very close to these books simply because I loved the films. I grew up with them. Me and my family used to go and see them every year when they were released around my birthday, and so I associate those happy memories with these characters and with this world. The Fellowship of the Ring was also a new favourite. I'm actually surprised by how much I enjoyed this book, because when I read it as a teenager, I found it really dense and hard to get through. But I don't know whether it's just because I am a more mature reader now, that whereas it is still very slow paced, it's not as dense as I remember it being. There are other fantasy books that I've read that were a lot harder to get through. I know a lot of people feel intimidated by The Lord of the Rings, but I do think that if you're used to reading adult fantasy, then you won't struggle with these. I think that they're a lot more manageable than their reputation would imply. Okay, so the next book on my list is The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. I'm going to put this in great because I liked this book. I really liked this book, but it didn't give me that new favourite feel. This is a young adult fantasy set in Russia, and it follows a girl called Vasya, or Vasya, I'm not really sure how you pronounce her name, but she lives in this village where they have always left gifts and food out for these spirits, and there are these myths and folklore that basically say that these spirits are there to protect them. But when a new priest arrives in town, things begin to change, and Vasya is the only person who can help protect their village from this evil force that is growing in the woods. If you're looking for a fantasy book to read in winter, then I think this is perfect because the setting is very cold and snowy, and The writing is so beautiful. It's very similar to Laini Taylor's writing and Maggie Stiefvater's writing, so if you like either of those authors, then I think you'd really enjoy this. So next on my list is The Diviners by Libba Bray, and this is another new favourite. I was actually really surprised by how much I loved this book. I read it for the Thousand Doors Readathon, and so I did read it quite quickly, but I wanted to read it quite quickly because I was loving it so much. This is a historical fantasy series that's set in New York during the 1920s, and it follows a main character called Evie, who has these special powers that could help her uncle and the police to solve a series of murders that have been happening in the city. What I loved most about this book was the way that the author created this atmosphere that made me feel like I was in New York during the 1920s. The characters had so much charisma. I gave this book 5 stars and I can't wait to read the rest of the series. Next on my list is Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor, and I read this book quite recently, but you know what? I think I'm going to stick this in new favourite as well because I really love this book. I would say that I loved it as much, if not more, than Strange the Dreamer. I didn't actually know a lot about this book before I went into it, but it's set in Prague and it follows a girl called Carew, who is an art student, but she was raised by this creature who runs a shop in another world that to get there you have to go through this portal. And the book basically follows Carew as she learns more about who she actually is, because she has never known anything about her past or where she came from. I feel like this is one of those series where it's just going to get better as it goes on, because I really liked the first book, but I loved the second half and the ending, and so I'm really excited to see what direction it goes in next. Okay, so the final book on my list is Crescent City by Sarah J. Maas, and this is an adult fantasy about a woman called Bryce who is half human, half fae, and she teams up with a fallen angel to investigate a murder. And there is more that I could probably say that wouldn't be considered a spoiler because it is included within the summary and on the back of the book, but I think that this is one of those books where you're better off going into it without knowing too much. I really love this book. It didn't feel quite like a new favourite, so I think I'm going to stick it in the great category. It was really fun and entertaining, and I really like the way that Sarah J. Maas writes characters, and I think that that is the strength of the book, is the characters and the way that their relationships and the banter that they have, how it builds up throughout the course of the story. This is actually the first book in a series, and I think the second book comes out at some point in 2021. We hope. So I'm really looking forward to reading that when it does eventually come out. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the video. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far. If you've read any of the books that I've mentioned on this list, then please let me know in the comments what you thought of them. Let me know if you've agreed with what I've said, and let me know if you agree with all of my rankings. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up and click subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.